Hey nerdy knitters, in this video we're looking at some tips for knitting on a budget. There's a lot of tips, I think I counted 20, and we're going to divide them into a few categories to simplify things. And at the end I'll have a few more tips about becoming a more confident knitter, so be sure to stick around for that. Sometimes it feels like the knitting community is an exclusive club where you should knit with really expensive, beautiful yarns or patterns from the latest hot new designer. I find I start feeling this way if I've been on Instagram a little too much, and it's time to take a step back from that. And if you feel that way, step back and think about your knitting and what brings you joy when you knit. Is it the latest yarn or pattern, or is it just the simple act of making something for yourself or a gift for someone else? Your knowledge and your skills are your value, not the yarn, however inexpensive or expensive it is, not who designed the pattern. It's your skills that you bring to the table. That's the important part of your knitting. If you start to feel that fear of missing out, that FOMO feeling of all the expensive yarn and patterns, take a step back from social media, wherever you're feeling that, and then just get back to knitting. Slow down and enjoy the process of what you're doing. I think when you're knitting on a budget, you have to think of it as being resourceful and not resentful of the things that you might be missing out on. Okay, now that I've got that off my chest, there are some timestamp links down below for these different sections because there's a lot of tips to share. First section we'll look at is tools. My first recommendation is to look at secondhand stores and garage sales. You can find a wealth of knitting notions and knitting needles at those locations. I suggest you try out a lot of materials. See what you like, buy them cheap if you can. And then once you've narrowed down what you like, it's a good idea to invest in a set of interchangeable needles. They're expensive, but a good set of interchangeables is all you need for almost all of your knitting. And when you link that with learning how to magic loop, which is my second recommendation, you can knit even really small circumferences on those needles. I know the set I use has 4-inch tips, so I can get right down to a 16-inch needle for hats and things like that. And I use long cords and magic loop for a lot of smaller items on those needles too. That's it for tools. In the next section, I want to talk about patterns. You can also look at secondhand stores and garage sales for books and magazines and things like that for knitting patterns. But I'd also recommend your library. If you have a good library, check out their resources and see what they have. See if they have magazines. See if they have digital options as well. I know through our library, I actually pay a membership for the city that's close to us because they have such a great library. And they have some online options. They have an app called RB Digital, which has, I think it's Interweave Knits. I can access back issues of that on there. And they have different apps and things. So check your library, see what options they have, and if you're close to a city, and it might be worth it to pay the yearly membership to have access to the library. Next on my list is online sources, especially for old patterns. I love to look at old knitting patterns and see how they used to do different techniques and things. One place I like to look is called archive.org. They have knitting books and magazines, some fairly recent and some older ones as well. And another option is openlibrary.org. They have some really good older knitting books on there too. I found Barbara Walker's Knitting from the Top on there and had a quick look at that. And there's a lot of other good options too that you can find there. Another one is the antiquepatternlibrary.org. There's lots of different craft related things on there, and they do have a knitting section with old patterns and things. That might be worth checking out if you like to look at old patterns especially. Now, on the topic of online patterns, there's a lot of free patterns out there, but avoid groups where they are basically pirating copyrighted patterns that aren't free. Designers work hard and they deserve the little money they make from a pattern sale. So when somebody takes a pattern they've purchased and they make it available for free online, they're stealing from that designer. So avoid any groups you find like that. And while you're looking for patterns, keep an eye out for patterns that use scrap amounts of yarn, like log cabin blankets or mitered squares. And the one I'm going to share here, the Safe at Home blanket by Margaret Holzman, is an awesome option for using up those scraps. It's a really cute blanket. One tip for all of those bits of yarn, divide them by weight and general fiber content. You don't want to knit a blanket that has fingering weight cotton and worsted weight wool. You want to keep your fibers and your weights about the same for your projects. So just keep a few bags handy and keep them all separated. That way when you find a scrap project, you have all the yarn ready to go. And if you have a few favorite designers, join their email lists. Sometimes they'll have exclusive coupons or even free patterns just for subscribers. It's worth checking into. Now our next section is about yarn. We're going to look at some general tips for yarn first. My first recommendation is to learn how to substitute yarns in a pattern. There's no rule that says you have to use the yarn that was used to knit the sample for the pattern. This is a very important skill for every knitter to have. You shouldn't have to depend on the designer to tell you what to use. This is something you can really figure out for yourself. At the very least, look at the weight of the yarn. Look at if it has a Craft Yarn Council stamp on it or something like that. You want to narrow down that category, whether it's worsted, fingering. Look at the category and then look at the fiber content. Don't replace a superwash wool with a worsted cotton. Those are vastly different yarns. Stick to about the same fiber and the same weight, and you're well on your way to making a good substitution. If you're not confident in your choice, look at yarnsub.com, type in the yarn that was used in the pattern, and it will give you a list of recommendations. Then I suggest you study those recommendations and see how they compare. What's the same, what's different about them? This is a vital skill for any successful knitter. If you want to be confident in your own knitting ability, you want to learn how to substitute yarn successfully. The next tip, secondhand stores and garage sales are your friend here too. I've been to a lot of different secondhand stores that have massive bins of yarn. A lot of it is red heart and some old acrylic, but take some time and dig through, and you never know when you'll find a gem. I've found some alpaca, some 100% merino. Another choice at the secondhand store is to actually look for sweaters that you can unravel and recycle and use the yarn. I've done it a few times and it's a bit of a learning curve, but it's not that hard to do. Just look for videos here on YouTube there's plenty that will walk you through how to do that, and then take a trip to the secondhand store and look at the sweaters. I like to look in the men's section because bigger sweaters obviously will give you more yarn. And avoid synthetic things, but look for natural fibers. Cotton is really easy to unravel as long as it's not mixed with an elastic type yarn or a nylon. Just 100% cotton. But of course, look for wool and wool blends. You'll find lots of good options at the secondhand store for unraveling yarn. My next tip is for craft stores. You can often find mill-end yarns in big bags for a lot less money than other yarns there. And if you're the type who has a lot of projects stored away and you know there's some that you're never going to finish, there's no reason not to frog that yarn and re-skein it or put it up in a ball again and use it for another project. I've even gone so far as to a sweater that I've worn a few times and really wasn't crazy about. I took it all apart and I knit a new sweater. Now my next tip is getting a color card. If there's a particular yarn line that you love or you buy a lot of yarn at one particular place, it is worth it to invest in their color card. I use Knit Picks a lot, so I got their palette color card. That way, when you are making choices, whether it's for a Fair Isle or just garment colors in general, you're not purchasing a sweater's quantity of yarn and then finding out it wasn't the color you thought it was. There's nothing worse than spending all that money and finding out you really didn't like the color. So it's worth the investment to get a color card if you like to shop at a particular store. And if you have a local yarn shop, it doesn't hurt to go in and check and see when their sales are. I know a local one here does a huge sidewalk sale every summer with really, really deep discounts. So it's worth it for me to save up my birthday money and maybe hop over there and buy some yarn that I've been hoping to purchase. And another tip about those yarn scraps that you save for your log cabin blankets or other projects, if you have a lot of smaller scraps, you can do what's called a magic yarn ball, where you knot the yarns together. You can use a Russian join, or you can even spit splice if it's wool yarn, and you can make your own balls of yarn with all of your scraps and little bits of yarn. If you want to get more adventurous with yarn making, look for tutorials on making yarn out of old t-shirts or plastic bags. Those are great for making market bags and things like rugs. It could actually be kind of fun to rip up old t-shirts and do that, I think. Okay, I have one more section with a few more tips on yarn, but this is more about those more expensive indie dyed yarns that you want to try. I also have a couple videos on affordable yarn choices linked here. One is for wool and one is for plant-based fibers, so be sure to check those out. All of the yarns recommended in those videos are less than $10 a skein. But what about when you want some of that special indie dyed yarn? My first tip for those indie dyed yarns is lighter weight yarns are going to be less expensive because yarn is sold by weight. So a skein of fingering weight yarn, you're going to get a lot more yardage out of that than a skein of bulky weight yarn. Now, if you really want to expand on your indie dyed yarn adventures, you can try dyeing yarn yourself. Get some superwash bare wool from Knit Picks or any place like that, and some packets of Kool-Aid, and look for Chem Knits on YouTube. She has some awesome tutorials that will show you exactly how to make some speckled yarns and fades, lots of different options. Okay, one more tip for those who love indie dyed yarns. Get a pound of undyed fiber and a drop spindle and spin your own yarn. Now I have 3 more tips to share, but before that, why don't you leave a comment sharing your tips for knitting on a budget? One of my goals here is to help you become a confident knitter, and these tips will help you with that. Learning to substitute yarn, even dyeing and spinning your own, all of those are important skills that you can use in your knitting journey. If you agree, why don't you give this video a thumbs up and click subscribe down below. Now on to our final 3 tips. Number 1 is ask. If you have a birthday coming up or holidays, research and make a list of those things that you'd like to splurge on and ask for money or gift cards to your favorite yarn shop or anything like that, and save that money for those big splurges. All right, second tip, educate yourself. There are so many books and free resources. There's no reason not to know something in knitting. You can figure it out, believe me. With 2 books, you could have an endless variety of sweaters. If you have a basic book that covers a lot of sweater options like this one, The Ultimate Sweater Book, or Ann Budd has some, her handy sweater pattern books, all of those cover basic sweater shapes for a range of yarn weights and body sizes. And you pair that with a stitch pattern book, one of Barbara Walker's books, or your favorite stitch pattern book. You combine those and you can make any combination of sweaters that you want, completely personalized without needing to buy a special pattern. Just 2 books, that's all you need. My last tip is to change your mindset. Like I said at the beginning, instead of being resentful about your lack of money, learn to be resourceful. We all have budgets. We all make choices about how we spend our disposable income. You know, if you have that feeling of missing out on the most expensive yarn or latest pattern, step away from social media. Get back to just enjoying the knitting process. Look for groups of like-minded individuals who are more inclusive and don't feel so exclusive. Don't give others the authority over you to make you feel shame for your yarn choices. There's nothing that says you have to spend a ton of money on yarn. You can make it affordable. You can make your knitting affordable. You can make beautiful garments in lots of different yarns. Enjoy the process. Thank you for visiting today. I would love it if you would leave a comment and share your tips for saving money, knitting on a budget, and how you do that. If you'd like to get a bit nerdy with your knitting, be sure to click subscribe and the notification bell so you'll know when the next video is posted.